Welcome everyone to this morning's special event. I'm Alan Matisow, the Associate Director of the Baker Institute, and I'm standing in this morning for Ambassador Edward Dirigian, who has to be in Washington on official business. The Baker Institute is, of course, a public policy institute, and what we do here is bring together scholars, journalists, people from government, political figures, in the hopes that their collaborations will produce ideas that will make a difference. We're interested in a lot of different issues, but right now among them are the social determinants of health, early childhood education, tax policy, conflict resolution, especially in the Middle East, the international and cultural dimensions of energy problems, and increasingly we're interested in issues relating to the border between the United States and Mexico. We do something else here. We bring to this campus, to this podium, figures from the world of public policy to engage our students and the larger Houston community. And on occasion, we have been fortunate enough to host people, statesmen, who I think might be accurately described as world historical figures. And we continue that tradition today. Helmut Kohl has, of course, served a long time as a chancellor, has many great achievements to his credit, but above all, he was the chancellor in the days when the Berlin Wall fell, when the Cold War ended, and when the Soviet Union collapsed. And it was his leadership and skill and vision that accomplished the reunification of Germany in 1990. So it is a great privilege to have him here with us this morning. Here's the program that we're going to pursue. James A. Baker III, who is the honorary chairman of this institute and was the Secretary of State during the first Bush administration, will introduce the Chancellor. The Secretary was, of course, the collaborator of the Chancellor during those great days and earned his own honored place in history during them. After the introduction, the Chancellor will speak briefly, make some brief remarks, and then we're going to throw the floor open to questions. And those questions, we hope, will inspire a discussion between the Chancellor and the Secretary. If you have not already figured it out, you have at your seats a device, and if you wish to hear these proceedings in German, you turn to Channel 2, and if you wish to hear them in English, you turn to Channel 1. Secretary Baker, will you come to the podium?
Thank you very much, Alan. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure and privilege to introduce our guest this morning. He is, without exaggeration, one of the most important world figures of the 20th century, as Alan has already mentioned to you. As Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany from 1982 to 1998, our speaker played a really decisive role in three of the most historic events of the last 50 years. The first of those was the peaceful unification of Germany after 4 decades of cruel division by the Cold War. The second was the European Union's decision to institute a common currency, the euro. The third was the Union's commitment to expanding its membership to include the new democracies of Central and Eastern Europe. It is, I think, probably the case that only Konrad Adenauer, the legendary first Chancellor of the Federal Republic, can rank with our speaker among post-war German leaders. And his historic role in European integration is reflected by the fact that he is the only living honorary citizen of Europe, an award that was granted to him by all of the European heads of state in 1998. He was also a firm supporter of the Transatlantic alliance throughout his tenure as Chancellor of the Federal Republic, and he was a trusted strategic partner of Presidents Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. He was, and I'm speaking now, ladies and gentlemen, from personal experience, a very close ally as we worked together to reunify Germany and to bring the Cold War to its peaceful end. In February of 1990, we met at Camp David, of course, the presidential retreat in the mountains of Maryland. Under the leadership of President Bush, the United States, and under the leadership of Chancellor Kohl, the Federal Republic of Germany, made an historic agreement. The United States would support German unification, provided that the Federal Republic of Germany would support the proposition that the unified Germany would remain a member of the North Atlantic Alliance and not seek a neutral status or a status aligned with the Warsaw Pact. Both sides, during the process of German unification, remained true to that agreement. Our speaker's subject is transatlantic relations, a subject that, of course, is both important and timely. The war in Iraq has revealed some extraordinarily wide differences between the United States and a number of our traditional allies in Western Europe, including Germany. I think that the alliance will survive, if only because the shared interests of the United States and Western Europe are so very deep and varied. But there's no doubt that some real damage has been done to that relationship over the course of the last year. I'm looking forward personally to our speaker's thoughts on what we can do and how we can go about repairing that rift. Certainly no one is better qualified to speak with authority on this critical subject. And so, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to present a good friend, a great friend of the United States of America, and a statesman in the truest sense of the word, Dr. Helmut Kohl. Helmut.
Well, dear Jim, Mrs. Baker, I am particularly pleased to meet you here today. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for welcoming me in such a very warm way. This is a very moving moment for me to be here in this institute that bears your name, James, and that indeed pays tribute to your life's work. And it's also a very moving moment for me because I'm reminded of the World Economic Summit that we had here quite a number of years ago together. And against the background of the debates and discussions that we had at the time, well, it's a very moving moment. Ladies and gentlemen, for me, this is in particular an hour where I would like to say a word of thank you to a friend, to somebody who's been with me for quite some time, who always stood unreservedly at my side and at the side of the German nation. James Baker was a stroke of luck for us at a crucial moment in our history, and quite frankly, I think he was also, looking back at what happened in the meantime, also a stroke of luck for the U.S. administration and the United States of America at the time. And we both were bearing very important responsibility together with our friend, the President, George Bush, whom we'll see this afternoon. I said that I owe you a debt of gratitude. I like to quote a German philosopher and theologian of the last century who said, gratitude is the remembrance of the heart. And that, I think, is a very important phrase because it clearly shows that what is at stake here is not only that one shows oneself to have a person who has common sense, but that one also remembers the rest of life's important things, that there are also things that are outside of just the world of reason. And let me say, by way of introduction to our discussion on the German-American relations too, I think that word holds true. The relationship as it stands now is, to me, at an unacceptable stage, and I think that a lot of things have to be done. Incidentally, I think on both sides. I think it's most important that we are again talking more to one another and not about one another. And if I stand here speaking to you, you see before you the representative of a generation that was 15 years old when the war ended. On the 20th of April 1945, Hitler's birthday, I actually had to take an oath as a young soldier manning an anti-aircraft installation. And looking back over all these years, looking at you, James, looking at your wife, I remember, for example, my wife, my late wife, who was a refugee. I told you this many times, James. She didn't have anything anymore. When we met in Ludwigshafen, we were close to starvation. And every day, around the year 1946, American trucks came to the school and the schoolyard and distributed food, soup or something that the Quakers had sent, that the Hoover Foundation had sent, and this saved us from starvation. Then later on, when we went to dance school, you know that I met my wife that long ago. The dress she wore and the suit I wore was one that the Quaker Foundation gave to me. And the suit, I think I will no longer be able to wear, but well. Hannelore had a lovely dress that she was given by them. It was maybe a little thing, but it was a great thing for us. It was something that these people gave us. And no matter what you may hear or read, there are a lot of stupid things also said and written in Germany. There are millions of Germans that have never forgotten and will never forget what the Americans did for us at the time. I chose this particular example. I could choose many, could tell you about many others. For example, the time when the airlift was installed in Berlin, the problems surrounding Berlin and so on. But I quite consciously and purposefully chose a more personal date because I think it's much more in the memory of people what they have lived through at a very personal moment. And this takes me back to the saying, remembrance is the gratitude of the heart. Looking over the rather unfortunate developments over the past few months, I think it is all the more important that we do everything we can in order to repair the damage that was done and to prevent further damage from happening. And there are a few facts, sober facts, that I simply would like all of us to remember. Part of the remembrance process is also to remember that 2/3 of the people currently living in Germany were born and raised after Hitler. They have no personal recollection of what I have just described to you on a more personal note. When I was still governor, or as we say, minister-president of the Rhineland-Palatinate in 1969, for example, in this particular state, federal state, with 3.5 million people, we had around 400,000 U.S. nationals, citizens that were serving in the armed forces and were based in the Rhineland-Palatinate. Quite often I said, well, if I fail at the ballot box in the Rhineland-Palatinate, I may have enough votes to perhaps stand as a candidate for Vermont. The votes would have sufficed. These days, there are virtually no Americans left. Most of the soldiers have been withdrawn. Most of the bases have been closed. And this natural link that was also established not only by the soldiers but also by the families that they brought with them, is no longer there. It used to be a matter of course that, for example, from the Hill, congressmen, senators would come over, would visit these bases, would have nice pictures with the soldiers there, and it was actually a boon to them in the election campaigns and in their own constituencies. These days, these things no longer happen. I could give you a whole long list of similar examples, but basically what is decisive, what is crucial, and nothing has changed here, is that Adenauer's sentence still proves to be true. Germany's peace, Germany's freedom is based on two pillars. First pillar is the building of the common European house, and the second, transatlantic partnership. That is to say, partnership with the United States of America. And the importance of this particular sentence is in seeing this not as an either-or solution or as a choice. It's both. Both are needed. The building of the common European house, friendship with the French, but partnership and friendship with our American friends is of the same importance if in the long run we want to preserve peace and freedom for our country. And the root causes for this actually are not in a military alliance, but more in an alliance of shared values. You have the same values that we would wish to realize for ourselves, which means in very concrete terms, should this country be tortured by the scourge of terrorism, it is a matter of course to stand shoulder to shoulder to one's friends and not withdraw or try to say, well, we have nothing to do with this, or ask the question, well, of what benefit is this to us? All of these questions are irrelevant when your friend is in danger. You should stand there and help him. But it's equally important to be candid with your friends, to be open to them, to tell them quite frankly what one feels one ought to tell them in this particular hour, and not tell them what perhaps the other person would like to hear. You have to tell him at certain points in time also what you think is true, and honesty, candor, I think, is a very good foundation for a solid friendship. And I don't see that now that a certain period of time has passed, this should have changed. I am absolutely convinced that the vast majority of my fellow countrymen shares this opinion. I would like you to understand that there are also, after all, 17 million Germans in reunited Germany who, until 13 years ago, lived in what was then the German Democratic Republic. And even those who were in opposition against the socialist regime of the time, for 40 years lived under a sort of umbrella almost that shielded them from the rest of the world, and where anti-American feelings could grow. This has certain consequences and causes difficulties, and I do think that we in Germany need to undergo some kind of awareness process. There are still difficulties between West Germans and East Germans, for example. There are still psychological barriers that we have not been able to remove overnight. I have learned a lesson too. I never thought that this would take as long as it takes. Now I know that we may be able to solve our material problems much quicker than we thought we would, but from a psychological point of view, to try to overcome those psychological barriers, I think we need a lot more time to get used to one another again, and to also develop this base of shared values. And this is obviously of some importance for German-American relations. And another point, I was you pay tribute, my dear friend, to the fact that I was one who tried to give a contribution to building the common European house. But building the common European house, being pro-European, does not automatically mean that you have to be anti-American. I think that is a foolish notion. there are differences in other countries. That is true. If I were, for example, French president, I'd be the president of the Grande Nation, the grand nation, and they have quite a different idea of who they are and how they should present themselves than we Germans. My American friends unfortunately never quite believed me when I said, but there is a difference and you have to acknowledge that difference. Well, Konrad Adenauer, and I think he's a witness who is above any suspicion, at some point in time said to us young politicians at the time, you need to salute the tricolor, the French flag, 3 times. The federal flag, the German flag, you only have to salute once, which doesn't mean a lack of respect of the German flag, but it's something that is a sense that shows a great deal of experience and wisdom indeed. You're smiling, James, but I remember when I tried to explain to then Foreign Secretary Schultz that this was actually something that he should remember. And for an American, it is something that at the time, at least for him, was quite unacceptable. But it only shows that this Europe that is currently finding itself, that is being enlarged, that in only a few years' time, let's say 10 years, that at least is my prediction, will have 450 million people and will then find its final legal form. That in these 10 years, over these 10 years, with these 450 million people pay with the euro. It will be one unified monetary zone. But at the time, the people in London and Zurich too, incidentally, will pay with the euro. When you say this in London or in Zurich today, people will laugh. They will never believe you. But when François Mitterrand in the early 80s and I, when we were discussing how we might go about setting up this common currency, then 2 people laughed. They said, well, that's a vision. It'll never come true. I'd like to tell you students here, my lifetime as a politician has taught me time and again that the true realists are the visionaries and not the ones who don't see any future ahead of them, who don't believe in anything. Thank you yet again for these very warm words of welcome. I am very pleased to be here with such a wise and good friend. He's just showed me his photographs. I stand in admiration, I must say. Before them, there is hardly any other American who'd be able to show photographs with himself and such many eminent contemporary personalities. It's a great, great pleasure for me to be here. A great pleasure also to see Susan here, and to see you both in excellent health and spirits. And I do hope that this will remain so for many, many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chancellor. There's a lot to think about in what the Chancellor had to say. And we would now like to invite members of the audience to pose some questions. So if you'll come to the microphones, we're ready.
Hello, Chancellor. My name is Clint Franklin. I must say that I no longer fit into my wedding suit either. I'm a bit bigger now too. My wife is German and is actually from the Palatinate. We have a son who is 17 years old and a daughter who's 12. So they're Germans and Americans. My question to you is,
will he become a German or an American? In Germany today, my wife can tell me what is the obvious from her upbringing, but the opportunities for children 18 years old, go on to a university, and become German as opposed to American? Are there differences? I'm sure there are. Are there major differences that I should be counseling them?
Wenn ich Sie recht verstehe,
Let me see if I understand you correctly. Are your children actually German nationals, or are they?
Bleiben in Deutschland jedes Sommer.
Well, no, I mean the nationality. Are they?
Oh, yeah.
Are they German or are they American nationals?
Beide jetzt. Sie must.
Well, they actually have both.
Yeah,
They have to
dual citizens.
decide.
da muss ich Ihnen sagen, diese Entscheidung müssen Ihre Kinder selbst treffen.
Well, that is a decision that your children have to take themselves, obviously with the assistance of their parents. But that is something where I am in no position to give you any advice. As regards to studies, I think it's possible here in the States, but also in Germany. Quite frankly, I suppose that over here, they'll be under a little bit more stress studying than at a German university, as far as I've known the system. But thank God we're currently changing the system in Germany. We're coming back to what I would call more normal, a more normal situation. But there was a time in Germany where people, I believe, have forgotten that it's not only your rights, but also your obligations, your duties that you have to think of.
One more question. Today.
Before you ask that question, may I just volunteer this fact that may or may not be known to our audience, and that is that Rice University is closely affiliated with the University of Bremen in Germany. And there is a close affiliation there. President Gillis of Rice started that, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. And we're proud of that affiliation. I just wanted our audience to know that.
I understand that's a fantastic program, too. We've been looking into that as well. Bundeskanzler, your message today, I listen with attention to what Bundeskanzler Schroeder has to say from time to time. How does your message today differ from his? Or does it?
Ja, es gibt einen großen Unterschied.
I think there is a considerable difference. He's
Er hat in einer Reihe von Fragen
He's
eine andere Vorstellung von Politik.
He's chancellor now, and I think there are a number of issues where we disagree, where he has a different perspective than I have. When he won the election in 1989, well, I had been chancellor for 16 years at the time, which was a very long time. And at this time,
Ich will alles so machen
he said,
wie Helmut Kohl, nur etwas besser.
I want to do everything just as Helmut Kohl did it, but just a little bit better.
Nun sage ich über
Well,
den Nachfolger Ausland schon gar nicht.
Far be it for me to say anything about my successor, certainly not abroad in another country. It's not my style, but most of my fellow countrymen don't have the impression that he's doing it better.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Kohl, my name is Lina, and I'm a junior student at Rice, and I'm from Russia, so to me it's so exciting to be able to see you now in person, because I remember seeing you on TV when I was little. And my question is, in 1989, the former president of Soviet Union, Mr. Gorbachev, went to see you in Berlin after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And when he met you, he addressed you as Erich Honecker. I was wondering if you remember that event, and what did you feel that moment when the whole world heard the president of the Soviet Union address you as a different person?
Das war aber nicht 89, das war später. Bitte.
He said it
We're not getting any translation from German into English.
Can you hear me all right?
Now we can hear you, Dorothy.
Fine. The Chancellor just said that it was actually not in 1989, it was later.
Oh. Well, that's what I remember my mom saying, but I was still wondering what you felt that moment.
Sie mit jemand anderem verwechselt hat.
Aber wissen Sie, der Unterschied zwischen Erich Honecker und
Oh,
mir
well,
war so
you
groß.
see, the difference between Erich Honecker and myself, I think, was so pronounced. Even looking at the stature, well, I mean, look at me, look at him from the outside. It was not really at any time a great issue for debate. But these things always happen.
Thank you.
Ich danke Ihnen.
Chancellor, my name is Michael Fetland. I'm time to time a terrorism expert on a local TV station, and I drive a Mercedes. It's saved my life once already. So, would you comment? When Secretary Baker was in Washington, we really had a global consensus and a global push. And from what the comments you just made with Mr. Schroeder, have the leaders today become less international minded and less building of bridges to one another rather than burning them? And not to put anyone on the spot, could you comment on that a bit? Because since Secretary Baker set such a high standard and was able to even bring the Middle East countries into the first coalition when I actually went on the local Fox station for the first time. But since that, we've had all this stuff during the last year, the French, the Germans, and it seems to me that there's a lack of international understanding perhaps than there used to be. Would you comment on that, please?
Ja, gerne.
Yes, yes, thank you. But I think I should say at the outset that I think it's wrong to just place blame at only one side's door. I think the mistakes that were made over the past few months were not only made on just one side of the Atlantic. I think Don Rumsfeld would certainly never have said there's an old and a new Europe. I mean, what kind of a wording is this? People over in Europe sort of looked at one another in bewilderment. I mean, the point is who knows something about Europe and who doesn't, and not automatically each member of, it's not the case that each member of this administration automatically knows something about Europe. Incidentally, now that goes for Germany as well. You have people with a background of this kind and people who don't. But I think that what we have now, is just sort of today. I don't think that it needs to remain this way in the future. You will see already at the next election in Germany when the candidates are asked, well, what about our relationship with the United States? The relationship with the United States is going to play a far more important role in the national debate. And incidentally, also over one issue that in our time wasn't all that much a matter of course. I mean, you're driving a Mercedes, you said. The economic relations, business relations between the United States and Germany, and this goes for both sides, and incidentally, between not only the U.S. and Germany, but U.S. and the European Union, this bond will increase dramatically. The business networks will increase dramatically, and there are certain constraints here, certain facts of life that even governments cannot change and certainly cannot overlook. I mean, I told you, in 10 years, as I see it, people in London will pay with the euro, and in Zurich too, and I'll tell you why. Because the City of London will certainly tell the politicians, listen, we will pay now our invoices with euro, and then the government will follow lead. And if the Swiss are, well, maybe the Swiss will have 3 more referenda about this issue, but then they will do their sums. And they certainly know how to count and how to do their sums better than anyone in Europe. And then at the foot of the bill, if it says, well, we can do business and this actually will bring us more of a profit, then they will join. All of this obviously is a bit irritating to me as well, because it did prove to be difficult for me in my political career from time to time. When I was in office, we call one another on the phone, heads of state and government, at least once a week, not only when we had problems, but just to maintain a personal relationship. And when I was chancellor, for example, I had different presidents as my counterparts on the American side. Ronald Reagan, for example, who was, as I think we all agree, quite a different person than his successor. When Ronald Reagan was a candidate for the presidency, he was in Germany for the first time. And I don't think he would disagree if I says at the time he knew very little about Germany, if anything. I know this story so well because my predecessor, Helmut Schmidt, apparently did not find time in his calendar for him, saying, oh, this man is far too old, he'll never be president anyway, it's a waste of time. And then he came to my office and we had a long chat and we then had lunch in my office. And incidentally, he never forgot this, nor did I. And then all of a sudden I met President Reagan. And then, well, his successor, President Bush, he was, after all, vice president, so we already knew one another, which was easier. Then came President Clinton, which was, as you know, a bit more difficult because I had come out clearly for the acting president, that is to say, for President Bush. In the election campaign, I always said to my people, you have, this is, after all, a man to whom the Germans owe a debt of gratitude. I also said to my American counterparts, you have to vote for this man. And still, Clinton and I got along very well. So if you want to, there's a lot of things that you can do together, but you need to talk to one another. You need to maintain a personal relationship. And this is something that we say over in Germany. Our mothers taught us this. Don't sort of do unto others what you would not like to do unto you. And but if you never say anything, if you pursue politics as a game through interviews and not tell your counterpart what you're actually after, then in the media, obviously, this will make you a very sought-after person. But in politics, you won't make any headway. That's just I think, a very old-fashioned, actually, type of politics.
Mr. Secretary, want to comment?
Well, I think the Chancellor has put it very well, Alan. I quite agree that it's really important if you're going to have good relations to be able to talk to your interlocutors in a frank and honest way, and rather than talking to them through the press. I also agree with what the Chancellor said about the fact that the fault here lies not on one side or the other. It takes, as I say, it takes two to tango, and it takes two to work out difficult political and diplomatic problems. Diplomacy is every bit as important as power or force, and yet we had a discussion in my office before we came out here about what really happened, and I can say this without implying that Helmut necessarily agrees with it. But I told him I found it very difficult to accept the fact, after what the United States of America did in terms of contributing to German unification, making sure that we took advantage of that window of opportunity to unify the two Germanys, against the wishes, by the way, not only of the Soviet Union, but of our allies, longtime allies, France and the United Kingdom. Very difficult for one who had been involved in that as I had to see 10 years later, or 11 years later, a German politician retain power
der an der Macht
on a political platform of anti-Americanism.
Plattform von
It was difficult. So the fault is not on one side or the other. The important thing is that we both understand how important it is that we get the Transatlantic Alliance back on track, how important it has been to the welfare of both nations, and indeed the United States and its other Western European allies as well, and that we not let our disappointment cloud our judgment.
Duncan Shane, by the way, the Mercedes is 13 years old and only has 250,000 miles on it. I definitely need another one. Thank you.
Question.
Herr Baker, es ist eine Ehre. Meine Frage in Beziehungen, in Diskussionen mit deutschen Studenten hier gibt es das Gefühl, dass Nationalismus in Deutschland etwas ist, was gar nicht akzeptabel ist, dass niemand stolz ist auf sein Land. Und in der Vergangenheit hat es solche Ereignisse gegeben wie Bitburg, als der Nationalsozialismus nochmal in den Vordergrund gerückt wurde. Glauben Sie, Herr Bundeskanzler, dass wir in Zukunft solche Dinge vermeiden können und unsere Beziehungen aufbauen?
Ich habe den letzten Teil Ihrer Frage nicht verstanden.
I must admit I did not quite understand the last part of your question. What does Bitburg have to do with nationalism? Maybe you've read the wrong papers from New York.
No, I simply meant that the legacy of Hitler and Nazism, as it came out with the soldiers buried in that particular cemetery at the Reagan
mit auf diesem Soldatenfriedhof die SS-Gräber und so. Haben wir das jetzt hinter uns gebracht? Ist der Narzissmus in Deutschland verschwunden?
Ja, bleiben Sie doch bitte nochmal am Mikrofon. Ich habe da gleich noch eine Frage.
Yeah, but I have another question.
Ich weiß nicht, woher Sie diese Kenntnis haben. Was Sie hier berichten, ist total falsch.
I don't know, because what you're saying is totally false. It's totally wrong, and it's not getting any better. You know, I can tell you how this happened. On the occasion of the invasion of 1944, the presidents and also the monarchs, incidentally, of the then Allied powers met in Normandy to celebrate, and I was invited at the time as Chancellor, and I said, well, I don't think I should go because this is not my place as a Chancellor. And then François Mitterrand and I instead met at Verdun, and this is where this famous picture was taken, where we were standing hand in hand. And then Ronald Reagan then said to me, I would like to do the same with you. I would like to go to a cemetery in someplace in Europe or in Germany and pay my respects. And this is how we chose Bitburg. And Bitburg actually is just an ordinary cemetery, as many in Germany, with an annex where you also have the graves of German soldiers, ordinary soldiers of the then armed forces. And apparently there was also a section with SS soldiers, very, very young people, incidentally, who were killed at the end of the war during the campaign in the Ardennes. Now, why did we go to Bitburg? We went to Bitburg because it was the president's visit at the time. Actually, was one where we needed a big airport with to land with the plane, and this is what Bitburg offered with the base there. And you had hundreds of journalists as well who were present there, and the Air Force commanders of the armed forces in Europe as well paid their respects on this particular day, as they would usually do, to the war dead of the Second World War. And incidentally, it's not as if there were eminent figures of the SS who were buried in that particular graveyard. When I was in the Senate at one point in time, one of the senators actually also raised this issue And it was Senator Kennedy, incidentally. He's never been known to be a particular friend of the Germans, which is why I'm giving you his name here. And he actually said, well, what was this thing about Bitburg? And I said to him, you know, Senator, and he too didn't really know the background story to it. I said, there were soldiers killed in the war who were buried in Bitburg, some of them also young SS soldiers, very young people, whose greatest mistake was that they were killed, because had they not been killed in this war, most of them were younger than 25, they would have taken prisoners of war, and it was would then have been ascertained from which SS unit they were. And had they been in combat forces, then around Christmas time 1945, because of an amnesty pronounced by the Supreme Commander of the U.S. forces in the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who incidentally, as you know, later became President of the United States, would have been released from imprisonment on grounds of an amnesty. And this shows you how the situation was at the time. And incidentally, Ronald Reagan, in this, as in other things, proved to be a great friend. When we called one another, I said to him, I know that you have great problems at home because of this visit. So if you feel that we're causing too many problems for you domestically, why don't you just cancel the visit? But, you know, I won't do it, because the soldiers of the Bundeswehr, of the Federal Armed Forces, who were there as a guard of honor, have fathers and grandfathers, and these are soldiers of the NATO armies, and they are fighting for our common freedom. So I have to acknowledge their feelings as well. But I'm grateful to you for asking this question, because that gave me the opportunity to say something on this.
Thank you too, Chancellor.
Secretary, you want to talk about Bitburg for a minute?
I was at the Treasury Department.
Mr. Secretary, will we terminate this at noon, or
Whatever. Yeah, I don't know what the program is. Maybe 5 more minutes.
Yeah, we have time for at least another question.
Yes.
We have a questioner.
Yes. Through my particular religion, we have associations with Hungarians in Romania, in Transylvania. And in dealing with them, we see this problem that the Chancellor addressed of, even though it's 12 years since the fall of communism, they're still affected mentally by their communist background and socialism. And my question is not so much from theirs, but from your experience with the Eastern Germans, what do you think the prospects are, and what should we be looking at in Iraq, where the people were under a brutal regime for 30 years or so? How long do you think it will take for them to instinctively do the things that a free and democratic people require?
I don't think that there is actually an analogy here, and anything in my experience that shows that there are similarities between Hungary and Romania and Iraq. I mean, Hungary and Romania are an integral part of Europe, a part of European culture and civilization. Countries that, irrespective of communist regimes in both countries, have a very long European tradition, cultural tradition as well, and also a religious one. One should not underestimate this. In Hungary, as well as in Romania, there's a very strong Christian tradition, a Catholic tradition, a Greek Orthodox tradition, and so that's a very much a part of that those countries' civilizations. And you can see that if you look at both countries, that the regime was quite different in the sort of harsh government and harsh retributions it meted out. For example, this couple was terrible, the one in Romania, the Ceausescu couple, in the way that they meted out what they thought was justice there. In Hungary, communist leadership was much more moderate, for example, than in Romania. Back to your question, I'm not a prophet. I am absolutely in no position to give you a time frame or a perspective, but I do think that indeed it is worth our while to show it to people, and not only the Americans to show it, but the Europeans too, to stand together and to show it to the people of Iraq that there is a perspective for them, that once they make a new beginning, they are able to reap the benefits of peace and freedom, because peace without freedom is no true peace, that they are then in a situation where they are able to actually develop their own potential in freedom. And I do hope that at some point in time they will also learn that religious convictions can only be conducive to peace if it makes you hold your peace with others as well, and that religious fanaticism has never proved of any worth to anyone. And the worst excesses in history were then carried out, then happened when there was religious fanaticism coupled with a national type of fanaticism. This will destroy everything. Even though I cannot give you a time frame, there is no alternative. I mean, it's quite a simple issue. What else can we do if not try to show these people the way to find itself again? We can't just stand back and say this is of no concern to us, because the moment that there is new despair, new want in this country, it'll be of great danger to all of us. I mean, I don't have to speak of Israel and the repercussions it will have on them.
Danke.
This will be the last question.
I have lived long enough to share a hair color with you, but I am of a slightly younger generation that grew up with the Cold War already started. And as a young man in my 20s and early 30s, it never occurred to me that the Cold War would ever end and that either side would win. It seemed like a permanent thing. You mentioned that in many ways or some ways that the politician with vision is actually more pragmatic than the so-called pragmatist. My question is, in 1982, when you assumed the chancellorship, did you imagine that the Cold War could end in 7 years or could end favorably? And were you planning, did you have a vision for a way that Germany could be reunited, or were you as surprised as I?
I'll gladly answer that question. When I became Chancellor, that was 1982, I was deeply convinced that German unity would come about. I never had a moment's hesitation that this would at some point come true. But had you asked me at the time, when will this be, my reply to this would probably be, well, whether I will live to see the day, I must say, I'm totally uncertain. And I would probably have said, will I see this in my term of office? I think you can safely exclude that. Had you asked me in 1982, and there were questions put to me at the time, and my replies to them are well known, I would probably have said, we will make greater headway in the unification of Europe than in the question of German unity. And another thing, I never had any doubt in my mind at all that the colossus of the Soviet Union would in the long run simply not survive, simply because this is against any historical experience. It's not all that difficult to understand. Never in history has there, in the long run, been a system, and this may take, in the long run, this may take 1 or 2 generations, Never in history has there been a country that in the long run was able to survive under a dictatorship, even if it's only an ideological dictatorship. There's this world famous saying what Talleyrand said to Napoleon I, when actually Napoleon at the time was at the apex of his power, and Talleyrand gave him as a warning this thought: Sire, you cannot rest on bayonets. You cannot sleep on bayonets. So if you think that in the long run you'll be able to maintain a government simply on military force, on troops and tanks, it will at one point in time just collapse. This is something that we have after all seen. I remember Honecker's visit to Bonn. I just asked him, well, Mr. Chairman of the State Council, we really don't know the people in power over on your side. We just read names in the paper. Who will presumably, and obviously I was being very cheeky there, who will presumably be your successor? And he just collapsed laughing. Even thinking of his needing a successor was something that he had never thought of. We, as you know, in German history have had similar people before him who thought that they would be there for eternity. 3 years later, his own people toppled him. And the trials, he had to stand trial even under the GDR government, the direct successors to his regime. I am absolutely convinced, and I could talk for hours at length about this, about similar dictators who failed in history. There was a crucial moment one night where I said to Mikhail Gorbachev, and I do believe it was the most important conversation we ever had. That was in summer 1989, and at night that very evening we sat on a wall bordering the Rhine, which was quite a strange view for many of lovers strolling by on the promenade along the Rhine who were looking up, incidentally, and seeing us there, and they saw Gorbachev and Kohl with an interpreter sitting on the wall. Must have been quite a strange sight for them. I said to the Secretary General, well, look at this stream, look at this river. The Rhine leads to the sea. You may put a dam into it. But this will simply mean that it overflows its banks and destroys everything in its way. It will, in the long run, reach the sea. And if the Germans continue to believe in their unity, they will be able to prevail. They will have their unity, even though I may not live to see the day. 15 months later, he himself said, we need to give free rein to this development that will then take its natural course. And we were not the only ones. He and others but helped us in a crucial and decisive way. Because it's not as if in Europe everyone was for German unity. My old friend Margaret Thatcher did think that 2 German states was a far better deal than just one. And among my European colleagues, there was Felipe González, the Spanish head of government, who was the only one who stood unreservedly at our side. And Gorbachev, I mean, not to forget him, perestroika and everything that led to. Apart from the people I just mentioned, our American friends, and particularly my friend who just sits next to me, what they did in the many talks they had with their foreign minister colleagues certainly is one of the most glorious chapters in your history. And that was not the president at the time, but he himself who did that. And thank you again, my good friend.
Thank you, Chancellor. Let me close the program, if I may, Alan, by simply saying that the view from this side of the Atlantic with regard to German unification was the same as the Chancellor has expressed to you. We did not anticipate that it would ever come as quickly as it did. We had no way of knowing that there would be such a narrow window of opportunity that we could take advantage of. We also did not anticipate that the Cold War would end, that the wall would come down when it did. That came as somewhat of a surprise to us, the way the events. 3 or 4 weeks before it happened, we began to think that it might happen. And I'm sure the Chancellor would agree with me when I say that, that the peaceful end to the Cold War was contributed to by many, many leaders on both sides of the Atlantic, but that history should really never forget the contributions of the leadership of the Soviet Union at the time, because it was the fundamental decision of Mikhail Gorbachev, encouraged by his foreign minister Eduard Shevardnadze, to renounce or reject the use of force to keep the empire together, that permitted the Cold War to end peacefully, and in fact that permitted the wall to come down and the GDR, the people of the GDR, to stream forth through the openings in the wall. Helmut Kohl, it's a wonderful privilege and honor for us to hear you today and to have you here at the Baker Institute. We thank you for coming. Chancellor Kohl and I and President Bush and President Gorbachev are going to be in Atlanta day after tomorrow for a conference on German unification, and tonight he will be at the Bush Library for those of you who are ready to make the drive to College Station. Thank you all for being with us.
Please leave your listening devices at your seat. Thank you.